Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the government's bill to privatise or partially privatise some of the nation's energy assets. Under this government, the New Zealand economy has run into some real trouble. In fact, you could argue that the wheels have fallen off this government's management, and under this bill they propose to sell the engine because somehow selling the engine will improve the performance of the New Zealand economy. In fact, every argument that this government has put up has been very weak.
Order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Every argument put up by this government around this privatisation program has been a very weak argument. Let's talk about the first one they put up. They said that companies need to be privatised so that they can access capital. Well, the problem for that argument is this. The money that is gained through the sale does not go to the companies, right? So the companies don't get any of the proceeds, so they don't get the capital that way. If the government sells 49% of the shares in the companies, the only other way that the companies can raise capital is to issue more shares. So they could issue more shares in these companies. Once they do that, the government will be required to buy 51% of all of the new shares issued if they are to maintain their 51% ownership. So the government would be required to come up with half of all the capital that these new companies require if they are to maintain their 51% ownership of the companies. Now, of course, the government has got no intention of providing half of the new capital to the electricity companies, and what is more likely to happen is that over time there will be a dilution of the government's ownership and it will go under 51%. The alternative, of course, is what they can do currently. They can issue bonds. These companies currently issue bonds, debt instruments, not equity instruments, to raise capital, and they will be able to do that under the current structure, just as they will have to do it once they're partially privatised, which is what they're going to do anyway. The second argument that this government then moved to, once the first argument was seen to be completely ridiculous, was the argument about debt. And they keep coming back to the debt argument. And I'm reminded of the quote from Roger Douglas, who was the previous architect of privatisation, who said many years after he'd conducted the privatisation, he wrote in a book, "I'm not sure we were right to use the argument that we should privatise to quit debt. We knew it was a poor argument, but we probably felt it was the easiest to use politically." That's what Roger Douglas said, because it doesn't make any economic sense to sell these assets to quit debt. It is not an economically rational argument or a fiscally rational argument. It is a politically rational argument, and that is why the government is now moved to that argument. Why does this argument not make any sense? The reason is very, very simple. The return on the assets is much greater than the cost of government debt. That is a simple fact. If that was not the fact, then there is no way you could sell these assets, because you couldn't take them to the market and tell people the return on these assets is actually less than the cost of government debt, so about 3 or 4%. No one would buy these assets if that was the actual return. The truth is the total shareholder return, which is the key measure that Treasury uses in actually measuring the return on the assets, is 18.5%. That is the total shareholder return according to Treasury on these assets. And so it is actually much more fiscally responsible to hang on to the assets, hang on to the dividend streams and the capital accumulation than it is to privatise the assets. And it is for this reason that Treasury, in the budget policy statement, were forced to admit this exact fact. If you look at the Treasury papers 2011 and 2012, where they look at the operating balance excluding gains and losses, so the operating balance, and they look at the impact of privatisation, Treasury say that the government are worse off by $100 million per year as a result of the privatisation program. So that's when you account for the lower interest costs because they've retired some debt or not accumulated more debt, but then you balance that off against the loss of the dividends and the capital gains from these companies. So when you balance those two things off, Treasury's advice is that the government is worse off by $100 million per year. Now, if the key issue is debt, government debt, the reason that we have government debt is the accumulated operating deficits. That is the reason why the government gets debt, is year after year it's run deficits, and under this government they've been very, very large deficits, and those deficits have to be covered by borrowing, and over time we accumulate debt. So by selling the assets, we make our debt position worse because we make the yearly deficit worse by $100 million per year. There is not a strong or even rational fiscal argument for privatising these assets. That is what Roger Douglas conceded after he was engaged in the privatisation program. It is a political argument. It is not an economic or fiscal argument. The argument doesn't make any sense from that point of view. So then let's look at the other argument the government's put up, which is around the efficiency of the electricity market. Now, if you recall, one of the things that this government did was that they swapped assets between Meridian and Genesis a couple of years ago in order to improve the competitiveness of the market. So because they were SOEs, they were able to force Meridian to sell some of its generating capacity to Genesis and force Genesis to buy some of that generating capacity, theoretically to improve the competitiveness of the market. Now, the problem is that they can do that when they're state-owned enterprises, but once they are partially privatised, they cannot require the companies to do that. So if, God forbid, Treasury got this a little bit wrong, and we find out later that the perfect electricity market has not been actually created through this transfer of generating assets, and we might require, in order to improve the efficiency of the market, a further transfer of generating assets, we will no longer have that capacity once the assets are privatised because the government no longer owns them 100%. So if your argument is that you want to improve the efficiency of the market, the electricity market, then you would not go down this path because it does not give you the ability to do what the government has just done, which is move generating capacity around if that's what you think is the relevant way to improve the efficiency, if a government thinks that is the relevant way to improve the efficiency of the market. Of course, we also know from the evidence presented to the Select Committee, never challenged by Treasury, that the private electricity companies currently charge higher rates than the state-owned enterprises. Now, we would have liked Treasury to have tested that evidence, but we weren't given sufficient time at Select Committee to enable that to happen. Mr. Speaker, we need to, I think, take a step back to the bigger picture here about the fiscal position of the government as well. The government has, if you recall, the government introduced some very large tax cuts for upper income earners. Now, these tax cuts were very, very large. Now, at the time, the government told us that they were fiscally neutral because they intended to increase the GST on middle and lower income earners in order to pay for the tax cuts for upper income earners. That was the central part of the so-called tax switch. And so the government argued that this would be fiscally neutral by making middle and lower income earners pay more for their groceries in order to pay for a tax cut for CEO for the banks. That was the deal. Unfortunately, this never happened, and in fact it was never fiscally neutral, and the government's books got thrown much deeper into deficit than they would otherwise have been. So in order to justify, in order to cover the hole in the government's budget that this government created through its very poor fiscal management, it's now saying to us, oh, we have to sell the assets because we've got a big hole and we can't afford to pay for schools and hospitals, because we gave the tax cuts to upper income earners, which are costing maybe $2 billion a year. It's hard to quantify in that order. Now, the thing when you think about it is most mums and dads do not have the money to buy these companies that they currently own. Most mums and dads New Zealanders are struggling to get the kids to school. They're struggling to pay the groceries because National increased GST to pay for the tax cuts for upper income earners. So most mum and dad New Zealanders simply will not buy these shares. A very small minority will. And of course the people who will have the money to buy the shares in these companies are the very same people that National gave very large tax cuts to. So if you earn $1 million a year, National gave you a tax cut of $1,000 per week, right? $50,000 per year was your tax cut from the National Party. So thank you very much for National. Now with that extra $50,000, you will be able to afford to buy a person will be able to afford to buy shares in this company. But most New Zealanders, they got bugger all out of the tax cuts and they can barely afford to make ends meet now. They will not be able to afford to buy a single share in these companies that the National Party are effectively handing over from all New Zealanders who currently own them. They are handing them over to a tiny minority who got the tax cuts, who have the cash in hand, who will be able to buy these companies. It is a shocking piece of public policy. It's bad for the economy, it's bad for the government books, and it is just bad government.
I call the honourable member Paul Goldsmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was half expecting the opposition to be talking about the mixed ownership bill, but he devoted half his speech to